What's up, boopers, and welcome to my Advanced Lancer Guide. I decided to split my Advanced Lancer stuff into two parts, PvE and PvP, seeing as how you play both of them are completely different. This video will be focusing mainly around PvE and tanking. Boop. First, let me start by saying that no matter how much you learn from reading and watching videos, there is no substitution for just good old-fashioned practice. Learn by doing. A big part of tanking in this game is timing, and timing around boss attacks and special skills which you should familiarize yourself with after fighting them repeatedly. You eventually learn how much time you have between their attacks to add on to your threat. I'll start this off by covering Spec, Gearing, and Crystals. For Spec, you'll want to center your glyph points around having the maximum amount of threat. At first glance, you'll see some glyphs that'll boost your damage and think they may be good to get because the more damage you do means you do more threat. But the amount of threat these glyphs provide through damage does not even compare to the amount of damage your DPS will be doing at 60. You must get the threat modifiers. For me, I get a glyph of threat for combo attack. Then I get all three glyphs for stand fast, and if you are wondering why, I'll explain my reasoning in a bit. I also get duration increase and cooldown lower for shield bash. Then I get increased threat for challenging shout and counter. And for the last bunch of points, I get increased duration on debilitate, then reduced cooldown on pledge, up the attack speed on adrenaline, and reduce the cooldown on master leash. Where Giga Chain. I'm just gonna call it Giga Chain. Giga Chain sounds cooler. Giga Chain, bitches! Woo! Boop. Crystals are very simple for a Lancer. For defensive crystals, you'll always want to use NR Kick and PvE to protect yourself against boss damage. There are some bosses that will just straight up hit you through your block on hard modes unless you have these crystals. You can get HP, but that just means you have more to heal for your healer. You're better off just lowering the damage and lowering the amount you need to be healed for. For offensive crystals, you'll want to get at least one threat generation crystal. If you have trouble with threat beyond this, you may want to put in all threat crystals. But given the DPS requirements for some of the hard mode bosses, I'd say you should get crit to enraged and boss damage crystals for the other slots. For your Zerks, I'd recommend either endurance or attack speed. At this point, you should already have the damage reduction needed to block hits, so you may not need endurance so much. And attack speed makes your life easier when it comes to getting threat attacks in between the boss's attacks without getting hit before you can put block back up. For gear, on your chest you'll want the base randomized stat to be boss damage reduction, then one of the plus stats to be boss damage reduction as well, preferably an easier obtainable stat like +3 or +6. Some other stats for the other pluses that may help will be enraged damage reduction or highest aggro target reduction, but at that point they'll just be luxury and not needed. For your gloves, ideally you'll want a base randomized stat to be threat gen. Even better if the +9 stat is also more aggro. For your boots, try to get 30% more balance and stun resist when under the boss's feet. And for your weapon, you want double attack speed, and then possibly boss damage and threat gen. The double attack speed is huge when it comes to being able to hold threat between hard mode and rage bosses attacks though. Lastly, if you bought the collector's edition of this game, you'll want to be using the level 40 attack speed necklace. This is the easiest way to get attack speed on your necklace, and since you aren't a huge damage dealer anyway, the damage loss from using a level 40 necklace isn't huge compared to the gain you get for increased attack speed that allows you to do what you need to do to a boss before throwing your shield back up. There is an attack speed necklace you can get out of Feign hard mode or Feign normal if you do the timed event, but it's only 4% attack speed, and I'd still probably use this one over that one, even if I got it. Alright, now that I'm done with all that, let's get into what it means to be a Lancer tank in Tera. In a group, your job seems obvious, but if that was the case, then why do so many people complain that Lancers are bad? Or they have a bad Lancer in their group, or whatever. Being a Lancer is easy, you can just taunt and block. Being a good Lancer, though, is completely different. A good Lancer can carry any group through any dungeon with his ability to maintain threat on any boss, control its position, and interrupt its dangerous attacks. And most importantly, never die. I've had situations where my entire group has died to some stupid AoE, and I had to stun the boss and run and res my healer, then go back to tanking and save the wipe. So, to tank properly, follow these steps for BAMs. First, threat. I'll go over threat completely here. The second you aggro a BAM, you want to try to keep its attention on you from start to finish. Now, right away you need to understand that this is just flat out impossible in some cases. If you have a good damage dealer, because threat in Tera does not work like in other games, Threat isn't something you just build up, and once it gets high enough you never lose it. Think of threat as like 100 points. The boss has 100 threat points, and he gives these points out based on what the people in your party are doing. At no point does the boss ever have more than 100 threat points. It just changes who has the points. If you continuously use Challenging Shout, you'll continuously get 40 points. And let's say you need 50 to have aggro. So as long as you keep using Challenging Shout and hitting the boss with high threat skills like counter, you'll stay above the 50 threshold and the boss will continue to attack you. Now, before you get all mathematical min-maxing, let me say that these numbers are just made up to give you a rough idea of how tanking works. First thing you want to note about this is that after level 50, healers naturally generate threat, even if they're just standing still doing nothing. So if you ever just sit there blocking, in theory, eventually the healers will out-threat you. But I haven't actually tested this myself, though. This is just going off of patch notes that they mentioned that the healers naturally generate threat. You should probably test this shit. But either way, you shouldn't be losing threat to healers at level 60. The major thing you need to know is that when your damage dealers learn... when your damage dealers eat a penis, then you fuck. The major thing you need to know is that if your damage dealers land huge crits or multiple crits in a row, no matter what you do, their aggro points will spike like crazy and they'll pull threat off of you. There isn't always a way to prevent this, but I'll explain it a bit. Because at any given time your damage dealers can have a crit string and pull threat off of you, you want to try to keep your threat as high as possible and continuously boost it to the maximum amount by using Challenging Shout every time it's available. You should also rely on your other high threat skills like counter and throw in some spring attacks with shield barrages between bosses' attacks. Remember that the right time to use Challenging Shout isn't after you've lost aggro. You should be using it so that you never lose aggro in the first place. For emergencies, note that Leash and Master Leash also have high threat components. And you also have Infuriate. Infuriate is a bit risky though, as it forces the boss into enrage while giving you 100% of the boss's threat. And even after you use it, if your DPS crit chain again, they can take back threat easily. Also note that some bosses, such as the last boss in Baldur's Temple, once enraged, does not unenrage. So if you use Infuriate on him, you might not have a good time. It'll be bad news bears. I found that out the hard way doing hard mode. On hard modes though, there are some bosses where generating high threat just simply isn't possible because of how fast and hard the bosses hit. For example, the Lancer boss in hard mode Fane. To deal with this, you must chain spam Challenging Shout between stuns on the boss and spam counter, and warn your damage dealers to ease off if they get any huge crits, as it is relatively hard to build threat a lot on this boss. Once you've got your aggro figured out, you move on to part 2 of tanking, positioning. This is a huge part of any successful group. Where and how you tank a boss completely changes how much damage your damage dealers can do. First, note that all damage dealers with half a brain will be using crit and damage from behind crystals, so they'll always want to be behind the boss. When aggroing a boss initially, do not try to turn the boss to cater to your melee. Turn it to cater to your ranged DPS. While melee have an easier time to move around the boss to get to its back by using skills like rolls and backstab to move through him, ranged have to run a wide circle around him to get behind him. Get the boss's back face towards the ranged DPS for their crystal bonuses, and let the melee cope with it themselves by making them move by themselves. They can handle it, they're big boys. After you've got the boss in a nice position, the next and most important part is to keep him still as best as possible. To do this, the first and obvious thing you need to do is to hold threat. The second thing you need to do is to use stuns. Stuns, 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 stuns. Anytime the boss is using a high mobility skill, you need to stop him. The longer he stays still, the easier time your damage dealers will have to burn him down without having to play tag or miss their attacks. You have 5 stuns, but with the boss's high resist, you may need to use all of them just to interrupt the boss once. When you are going for a stun, you also need to be careful. Know that if your stun doesn't hit, you leave yourself vulnerable, very vulnerable to take a hit from the BAM. That's why it's a good idea to try to keep Iron Will up. That way, when it comes time for you to stun, you are less vulnerable if your stun resists. First, try to use Shield Bash. If it fails, use Leash, then Master Leash, then Giga Chain as a last resort. Shield Barrage isn't reliable enough as a stun to use in tight spots because first it has to proc, then it has to not get resisted. It's a luxury stun if it happens, but don't rely on it. Now, the last thing you need to do for your group is help damage and protect your allies. You may not have been using it yet, but you have a spell called Pledge of Protection that is easily one of the best spells in the game. It takes the damage of your allies onto yourself and then reduces the damage they take, mitigating it by your armor and not theirs. Using this on a boss like the last boss in Fena Caprima during his spins can save your DPS from dying. It also transfers damage from DOTs, so on bosses that are particularly difficult to control and stop from doing AoE attacks, spam Pledge. It saves the lives and makes your healer's job way easier. An example of using Pledge is on the first boss in Fainhard, where he only has 4 pulls to protect you from the fire AoE. If your DPS isn't fast enough to kill him and you eat another fire AoE, you can pop Pledge of Protection to take enough of the damage onto yourself so that only you die and the rest of your group stays alive to continue fighting the boss. Then your healer can res you, and you can take the boss off of your damage dealers and continue fighting him, preventing a wipe, giving you a bit more time to burn the boss before the next fire AoE, in which case you can cast Pledge again and take one for the team a second time until the boss dies. The last 2 spells I want to make sure to mention is Debilitate and Menacing Wave. Always have Debilitate stack. Always, always, always. No matter how much damage you think you are doing or how little difference you think Debilitate makes, always have it up. The first thing you should be doing against any boss is trying to get this stack to full. Once it's stacked to full, never let it drop. As for Menacing Wave, make sure you use this to keep the boss slowed down, as it helps a ton in terms of dodging the attacks and getting attacks in on the boss before he gets attacks in on you. Note that Menacing Wave does not affect attacks already in motion, but if a boss starts an attack with Menacing Wave debuff on him, it'll be slow, even if the debuff wears off before he finishes his attack. It'll continue at the slow speed until he finishes through the attack. I know a lot of you were hoping for a set rotation for tanking, but there just really isn't one. There's just all of these points you need to have in your head. How you play changes based off of how the boss is acting, and they never act the same way from fight to fight. You must practice and learn their attack patterns so you know when you have enough time to cast something between their attacks and when you simply just need to sit there and block, or when you need to try and stun them to interrupt what they're doing. That's it for my Advanced Lancer guide for PvE. I'll get one up for PvP in a bit, but note that PvP is completely different and the playstyle will be nothing like PvE, and it'll take a lot more practice if you want to start winning duels against good players. Anyway, I'll see you later, guys.